Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. I'm doing a second video today to talk about the topic of the relationship between nature and grace. This is mostly an exercise in me kind of recording my thoughts as I make my way through certain theological ideas. So, I'm working through this still. I have a lot of literature ahead of me that I need to read to get a grip on this conversation. It's a very complicated and multifaceted conversation, so bear with me. And mostly, I'm doing this because I want to record my thinking so I can come back to it and see what I used to think and if I've changed my mind, made progress, or am more confused or not. But long story short, this is a very thorny theological debate that involves a lot of different players, and I am trying to approach it with an attitude of humility, an openness to the truth, and without a kind of polemical, I don't know, factionalism. Right? I'm interested in what's true. I'm interested in what the church teaches in her tradition. And so I'll just kind of make my way through all this information. But I want to start today with, this conversation between nature and grace usually revolves around a reading of St. Thomas Aquinas. On the one hand, you have the Neo-Scholastic reading, which itself is not completely uniform. Um, the best representation in that camp, I think, is probably Father Garrigou Lagrange and another Dominican, shoot, what's his name? Ambroise Gardet. And they, have a neo-scholastic understanding of St. Thomas's treatment on this subject. They talk about a category, which we'll hopefully talk about, which is obediential potency, and the relationship between nature and grace from the sources of revelation, according to St. Thomas. Now, the other reading is, some of you know, the reading of Cardinal Henri de Lubac, which he published a book in, I think it was in 1946, called Surnaturel. And in it, he challenged the contemporary reading of nature and grace amongst the neo-scholastics. And, I also realized in doing some research on this, and again, I'm still at the beginning of my process here of reading into all of this stuff. Um, there's definitely the more sophisticated reading of Father Lagrange and Father Gardet, and then there's a kind of let's say less sophisticated reading that you find in some theological manuals that people who are good neo-scholastic theologians would agree that those were not a very good presentation. That's been my understanding so far. I've personally seen some presentations of it that are not very good and that would be rejected even by neo-scholastics. So I think we're all in agreement that there's a kind of really bad way of presenting this that has been tabled. That being said, the Thomistic commentary tradition has an approach to this that is a serious one, and I have actually some things to say about it that hopefully you'll find interesting. Um, but also de Lubac, right? So at first, de Lubac's criticism was it was pushed back against by the neo-scholastics, and there was a debate. It was pretty heated. There's still some some wounds there that we got to work through, and I hope to contribute. I don't know how, but I hope to. But eventually, especially after the council, de Lubac's reading was taken as normative, and he had won, quote unquote. Now I'm a friend of de Lubac, intellectually speaking. I like him. I like what he says. But I am also realizing it's much more complicated than it might seem at face value. So this conversation is lively and it continues. And again, everything I'm saying in this video, again, take it with a grain of salt. I'm working my way through this. I want to approach this with humility and honesty, and I'm interested in what's true. And I don't want to put anyone, I don't want to put anyone's position as the right position simply because I like them. So, um, anyway, I'll leave things there. Now, I do want to introduce Ratzinger in this conversation because Ratzinger does explain what he thinks about the relationship between nature and grace. And although he doesn't seem to say, at least I haven't come across this yet, he doesn't seem to explicitly say that he thinks de Lubac gets it right about the relationship between nature and grace in St. Thomas, nor does he say that the commentary tradition gets it right. Uh, in fact, I'm pretty sure he'd say the commentary tradition does not get it right. Um, he hasn't really looked into it, I don't think, Ratzinger, but he sides with the Franciscans. So he sides with St. Bonaventure. And I think it's worth exploring St. Bonaventure's position because it's very interesting and it adds a voice to this conversation that ties into some authors like St. Maximus the Confessor in a way that I find very interesting and that will inform at least my approach when I come back to de Lubac and the Neo Scholastics. Because I think that they both are. The problem with this debate is I think a lot of people are saying things that are true, you know, about this topic, but they're talking past each other, and there is, I really do think there is an ambivalence in St. Thomas himself, a kind of um, how to put it? There's Thomas himself seems to be saying two things. Now, of course, people would disagree with me that people would disagree with me on that, especially the neo-scholastics. But in fact, you know, supporters of de Lubac will also disagree with me on that. So, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get into Joseph Ratzinger. Before we do that, I do want to lay the lay of the land. I want to go ahead and open up with some observations about nature and some observations about grace and some observations about justification and the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council, and just kind of, you know, set the table here before we get into this. Okay, so in this book here called Dogma and Preaching by Joseph Ratzinger, published by Ignatius Press, it's the first unabridged edition. On page 144, um, Ratzinger opens up the section begins on page 143, but it's a section called Gratia presupponit naturam, grace presupposes nature, reflections on the meaning and limits of a scholastic axiom. And so on page 144, he begins by talking about the denial of nature, right? So we have an issue in today's world, on the one hand, which is the denial of nature. And on the other hand, we have a kind of dualism where the supernatural world is stacked on top of the natural world. And we're going to get into that. But beginning with the denial of nature, Ratzinger says, on the one hand, the theological denial of nature has been easy to combine with eschatological Marxism, which knows no nature, but only facts that must be changed in order to bring a disastrous world to salvation. So, this is Karl Marx's understanding, which is that we're faced with these situations, right? These sociological and economic facts that need to be changed in order to bring about a new humanity. In other words, the nature of man is kind of stripped from man by Marx. And in the stead of man and his nature, we have this conglomeration of societal, social, and economic factors that are oppressive. And we need to free man from them by changing the status quo, Marx would say through revolution, and bring about the salvation of this world through our doing, through our, you know, because the word fact, it comes from the Latin verb facere, which is to do, right? Our work. So that's the first thing he says. And he continues, as a third member of this alliance, we would mention Sartre, his existentialism, his existentialist nihilism, to be specific. Man has no essence for Sartre, only existence. So, just to explain that, right? Man is a particular kind of being who has existence. The first act of man's nature is to exist, but it's an act of existence that is limited. It's not the act of existence itself, because that would be God, pure actuality, right? This is you know, St. Thomas's metaphysics. But man is limited by his essence, and so he can't, you know, just be whatever he wants. There's a mode. A man is existing qua man, as man, and so For Sartre, right, man has no essence, no limiters, right? And if he does, he has to get rid of those, right? Only existence. And so each individual creates his essence anew for himself. So Sartre really believes in kind of creating oneself, right? And we see how that's connected to Marx here, who wants to create a new humanity, right, through revolution to get rid of these oppressions and kind of let loose and a kind of freedom from all constraints, especially economic and societal. So Ratzinger basically says here that for Sartre, what man is decided only by what he makes, right? So here in this first criticism, right, Ratzinger is putting Sartre and Marx together as champions of this idea that nature is denied, it doesn't exist, right? That's bad according to Ratzinger, and according to I agree with him basically, right? And here he criticizes the neo Thomists. Now, I will be fair to them as I go along and bring up some of their what they say and what they teach, and I think there's actually a lot more there than I thought. So I don't want to scare anyone away here who disagrees with me. Okay, he says here on the other side stands a naturalism that regards the distinction between nature and grace as the building up of a totally meaningless supernatural world that must be dismantled as an ideology in favor of what alone is real. So I'm going to correct slightly what I said. This is not the neo Thomist perspective, although it builds off of it according to Ratzinger. And so here he's saying basically, if you have nature right here and the supernatural, right, which is what the church brings, it's revelation, grace up here. And, remember with Kant, we have this idea that the metaphysical is the noumenal, right? We can't really know anything about it. All we can know is our experience, right? The phenomenological. And so, with this kind of shift where metaphysics becomes secondary to epistemology, how we come to know things, thanks to Descartes, well, eventually metaphysics gets dismissed, right? Now, that's in the realm of philosophy, but it applies as well in the realm of theology, where the supernatural is dismissed as that pious stuff that people believe that's not actually real. What's really real is what's going on here below, right? And so hopefully you can see how both of these views actually are brothers, right? They are saying something quite similar. Um, Although one believes that nature doesn't exist, all that exists is what we do, right? The other is saying nature exists and the supernatural is on top, but we're going to dismiss the supernatural as, basically, coping mechanisms concerned with the anxiety of existing, right? And just let's get real, right? Let's be honest here, and what's really real is what's around us. Only He says, right, dismantling an ideology in favor of what alone is real. Okay, so he ends this section here by saying, in the end, the naturalism that melts grace down into nature leads to the same result as the supernaturalism that disputes the existence of nature, and by denying creation makes grace meaningless as well. So they both end in the same place. The fanaticism of those homilists who mock nature, presumably for the sake of grace, is always frighteningly close to the cynicism of the atheists who mock God for the sake of his creation. So these are dead ends. Ratzinger wants to say that we can't deny nature, and we can't affirm nature in an autonomous way from the supernatural. Both are dead ends. That's how he opens up. He's laying the table here. And one thing I want to say is, speaking of de Lubac, again, this is dense theological. This is a dense theological conversation that I'm still trying to come to terms with. So bear with me. But I'm hoping that this will be something that other theologians will watch and give me feedback on as I work my way through it. But for de Lubac, his main criticism is that if you do have this kind of two-tiered, nature and grace perspective, then you're almost you're giving nature too much autonomy, right? And so de Lubac is going to say that nature is made for grace. There's something within nature, which is controversial, that is only fulfilled in grace. And the Neotomist said, well, this seems to call into question the gratuity of grace, because if nature is made for grace, then God would seem to owe to nature its end, right? Which is grace. But the whole point about grace is that it's not owed, but it's a free gift. So they were criticizing de Lubac for that. But de Lubac was saying the issue here is that if you make nature autonomous, then you make grace irrelevant and revelation irrelevant, the supernatural irrelevant. And that seems to go hand in hand with secularism, where the world has its own autonomy and the church, revelation, and God become something relegated to the private sphere and irrelevant. It creates a sort of practical atheism. And de Lubac was saying this, especially if you look at his context with a secularized France. He had been exiled for a while because of the animosity that the French state had towards the church. So there's definitely something there to de Lubac's criticism, because if you give nature such autonomy, it seems to lend itself to the privatization of religion, and it also seems to go hand in hand with secular atheism, which he raved against. So, and yet, is grace owed to nature? No. De Lubac will also say it's not owed to nature. But the Neo-Thomists would say, but yeah, but your schema, right, makes it so that it is. And if you look at St. Thomas, the Neo-Scholastics will say, well, it seems that St. Thomas, thinks of this in terms of nature having its own autonomy, and yet because of revelation being opened up through what they call obediential potency, which we'll look at, towards a supernatural end that is available to man in Christ. Now, that was another aspect of laying the table here between de Lubac and the Neoscholastics, as I understand it so far. Another thing I want to bring up is how this connects to justification, sanctification, the soteriological conversations that were going on during the time of the Reformation and the Council of Trent. So I wrote assignment for school. It's looking back, I see things all the time when I look back at some of my work, and I'm like, you know what, I didn't write that well. That section there is ambiguous. I missed this whole point right here. Anyway, that being said, I'm still going to read it, at least the opening of it, and it relates to this conversation. So I wrote, if we distinguish grace from nature too much, then nature has no needed faculty to receive grace. I'm going to explain that. It has no openness to grace. I'm going to actually reread that just for the sake of repetition. If we distinguish grace from nature too much, then nature has no needed faculty to receive grace. It has no openness to grace. And here an example I gave is that it would be like offering divine life or the knowledge of divine mysteries to a rock. A rock is not that thing which can know divine mysteries because it's not intellectual, right? And so the result would, at best, be a form of robotic manipulation of the nature in question. So it's like kind of adding some kind of computer program in the structure of the rock, but it's not really the rock. It's very extrinsicist, is the point I'm making here. Um, so to reread that one section, the result would, at best, be a form of robotic manipulation of the nature in question. It could not authentically be elevated into grace. So that's the problem with separating them too much. And yet, I add here, if we fail to distinguish between nature and grace, so if we collapse them too much, right, then we are ascribing a supernatural dimension to the powers of nature, right? And so, here it's like, well, what makes the supernatural different from the natural? If we're saying that the supernatural has these kind of, this kind of telos towards the supernatural, it has these capacities for the supernatural. Um, so let me reread that. If we fail to distinguish between nature and grace, then we are ascribing a supernatural dimension to the powers of nature, something which ironically ends up collapsing the very notion of the supernatural. It would be kind of like a naturalizing of the supernatural. This is the criticism the Neo-Thomists have of de Lubac. So I put these two extremes are connected to other erroneous doctrines, such as Pelagianism, right? Nature can save itself. um, if it has this kind of supernatural capacity, or or if it's designed for a supernatural end, then God owes it to nature, and so there's something in nature that deserves grace, and that would be Pelagian. I hope you guys see that. It's also connected to Calvinism and to some Lutheran views on justification, um, and the Council of Trent talks about this. And it's connected to the Protestant reformers because for Luther, there's this really strong extrinsicism, I would say Calvin as well, because Calvin and Luther both agree on the total depravity of nature. But before I want to get into that, but before I do that, let me continue what I wrote right here. If nature, qua nature, can attain God, then grace is no longer gratuitous. And man's nature can accomplish what Catholic theology teaches can only be accomplished through God's grace. If nature and grace are collapsed, then in the fall, man's nature becomes totally depraved. Let me reread that section. If nature, as nature, can attain God, then grace is no longer gratuitous, and man's nature can accomplish what Catholic theology says only God's grace can. If nature and grace are collapsed, however, then in the fall, man's nature becomes totally depraved. Furthermore, if nature is overly distinguished from grace, then we remain sinners, all the while being covered extrinsically, right, by the grace of Christ through external, extrinsicist, legal imputation. And that Canon 10 in the decree on justification of the Council of Trent pushes back against both this radical separation and this collapse, right? It pushes back against a kind of extrinsicism and a kind of intrinsicism. And so Canon 10 reads, if anyone says that men are justified without the justice of God, by which he gained merit for us, and or that they are formally just by his justice itself, let him be anathema. Now that's tricky. Let me read that canon and kind of break it open for a second here. If anyone says that men are justified without the justice of God, so it's condemning Pelagianism here, right? By which he gained merit for us. God merits our salvation, and we don't because it's a gift, right? But then it says, or that they are formally just by his justice itself. What that means is that we're not just merely by God's justice, but we are made just, right? So you have here, it's not just extrinsic, there's an intrinsic justification. And so it's this paradox, it's this fine Catholic line, right, that you find oftentimes in these magisterial texts throughout history. Anyway, I just want to set the table on the justification question. Okay, moving forward with Ratzinger, maybe I can recap real quick. Um, so Ratzinger opens up by basically saying that you have one trend, which is a denial of nature, right? It's basically you find this in Marx and you find it in Sartre, right? Which is that basically um, man is reduced, for Marx, to economic and social factors, right? And those factors are what is real, and man has to change them through revolution and bring about the salvation of this world, right? That's bad, of course. Then you have in Sartre this idea that there is no nature to man. He's not limited in his existence, right? Man is first radical existence and he creates his own meaning and he is freed from the burdens of his nature, which limit him, right? Again, both Marx and Sartre deny nature. And that leads to a kind of atheism for Marx because nature is stripped of its weight. And God is not the one who saves us, but we save ourselves. And for Sartre, right, if God exists, right, and He is pure existence, then we derive our existence from Him, which means we're limited, which means we have natures, which means we're not free, right, and so if we deny God's existence and assert our existence and deny our own nature and essence, then we kind of become this self-creating God, basically. So that's the denial of nature from those thinkers that Ratzinger says that's a devastating move. We cannot go down that road. The second point that Ratzinger makes is that if we have this pure naturalism idea where nature is what is really real, and the supernatural is this nice pietistic stuff that the individual believes because it helps them cope with the anxiety of life, right? Well, then it actually it brackets the supernatural and makes it irrelevant. And all that matters is what we all agree is really real, which is the natural world. And again, God is sidelined and denied. And those two things are bad. Now, finally, when it comes to justification, Luther, Calvin, Pelagianism, the Council of Trent wants to hold both the distinction between nature and grace. Um, and wants to avoid a radical division between nature and grace so that man might be justified by God and not by himself. And then when he is justified by God through a free gift that he didn't earn, then that justification doesn't remain extrinsic, right? But becomes a living intrinsic reality. So Trent is also, Trent here is on riding a fine line. Okay. Now, talking about Calvin and Luther, Ratzinger here brings up through Barth's understanding, at least early Barth is what Ratzinger tells me, understanding of the depravity of man, and he kind of gives um, a steel man of the Protestant position here, and he does so very well, I find. And this is what he writes. So again, this is the Protestant understanding. Now, Protestant's a big category. This is the total depravity understanding that Luther and Calvin would ascribe to. Although uh, Luther's not so clear on it sometimes, so it's more Calvin. But here's what he says. Okay, Ratzinger here. Man's sin consists of the fact that in the end he seeks himself in everything, that selfishness is the secret driving force of all his activity. This does not exclude a morality that is quite orderly, but it does mean that even the best moral attitudes and actions of man are somewhere and and somehow corroded by the fundamental attitude of selfishness, self-assertion, which man can never entirely get rid of. So just to stop there, what Ratzinger is saying is that according to this vision, right, man is riddled through and through with a ultimate selfishness, right, and that doesn't preclude the possibility of a moral system to guide society, but ultimately it's ruled by this essential selfishness, right? And so we can talk about morality, but it has nothing to do with man's salvation or with the work of God. This is morality that is in the realm of depravity. It's just, I mean, you see this in the liberal state, quite frankly, which is this kind of realpolitik, right? Realpolitik is a German word that just kind of means a truce, right? Like you want to kill me, I want to kill you. The state says don't kill each other or I'll kill you. And so, in other words, no one's killing anyone, but that's not peace because everyone's living and not dying, but because of the threat of violence, right? And so that would be the morality that is possible in this scenario. And so Ratzinger continues, and to press the point further, one could reflect that the Pharisees, for instance, from a purely moral perspective, certainly stood upon a considerable height. But precisely their case shows that mere morality is not enough because it is obviously incapable of overcoming this insidious secret of selfishness, which theological tradition somewhat misleadingly calls concupiscence. So here, what's interesting is that you really hear the echoes of Luther. I was reading something. I can't remember where it was, but there's something really interesting. Was that there was a Lutheran scholar who engaged in conversation with Ratzinger, before, way before he was Pope, and or it might have been actually, I might be wrong. It might have been when he was Pope. There was a conversation. It might have been head of the CDF. It doesn't matter. Between Ratzinger and the Lutheran walked away and said to someone else, like, Joseph Ratzinger, that man knows Luther. He knows Luther better than some Lutherans, right? I don't remember where I read this. If I find it, I'll put it in the show notes. I'm not making this up. Just trust me on this. But long story short is that here you see Luther's dilemma, and I discovered all this through reading E.P. Sanders and the New Perspective people on Paul, right? Um, but long story, and also what's that essay by? It's that essay on Paul and the Introspective Consciousness of the West. Really important essay that really is kind of a turning point on Luther's misunderstanding of Paul here. I'm on a tangent. The point being is that for Luther, Paul, right, thought he could be saved through the moralism of the law, and he represents that as a Pharisee. But he realizes that nothing in morality can actually save you because of this inherent selfishness. And ultimately, it's going to be an extrinsic dictate of law from God that will declare you innocence, but it's an extrinsic imputation that does not change man internally, doesn't make him just, it declares him just. But then, of course, there's a whole, theology of sanctification in Lutheranism, and Lutheranism is it's not a monolith. So we did have that joint declaration. It's a lot more complicated than that. I'm summarizing things here, so bear with me. Okay, moving on with Ratzinger, and I'm almost done with this section. He says here, but now Reformation spirituality says that just this fundamental attitude of selfishness underlying one's individual acts is the sin of man, of which the individual sins are only secondary outgrowths. So I think this is a good section to point out that oftentimes in apologetic circles, I'm discovering this more and more, is that Catholics and Protestants oversell themselves. They take certain things for granted, and often I was telling someone recently is that when someone disagrees with you, actually assume that their system is much more coherent than you think, even though it might be wrong. A lot of times, an incoherent belief, right, is coherent with other incoherent beliefs. So, what I'm saying is that here, this is the argument that you hear Protestants make, that there's no such thing as the difference between mortal and venial sin. And at face value, the Catholic will be like, well, that's not coherent. It's worse to do this than it is to do that. Sins have different levels of gravity. But the Protestant understanding of all sin being sin stems from their soteriology and really from their metaphysics, even though sometimes it's an assumed metaphysics that's not explicitly explained by them. And it stems from this fact that nature is totally depraved and that any kind of moralism is essentially colored by selfishness. And so the various individual sins are various expressions of the ultimate sin, which is the same at all times. And so that's what they mean when there's no difference between mortal and venial sin. They're not saying that there's no difference in the sin itself, but there's no difference in the sinner. He's not more or less guilty, according to the Protestants. That's coherence, even though it's wrong, according to my reading, right? But that's coherence. Okay, continuing. I'm going on tangents here. I apologize. Okay, so, and this Protestant view adds, the attitude of selfishness, of self assertion, is man's natural stance. It came to be so through original sin. It is his nature to be selfish. So nature is depraved, right? Essentially. This means that he is by nature a sinner, by nature. And does not Paul say, in fact, that, quote, we were by nature children of wrath, end quote, from Ephesians 2:3. And do not the existential analyses of contemporary philosophy and psychology corroborate this disillusioned view of man, who lives in the state of being authentic and having fallen into anonymity and a state of arbitrariness and fear, out of which only a repeatedly renewed decision to surrender himself can save him? So here you see, I love how he does this, right? He's tying in Sartre and Marx and others into their origins in a certain sense in the Protestant Reformation. But he also shows the coherence here, right? Which is that if my nature is totally depraved and it's marked by this radical selfishness and even functional moralism is not righteousness, then the only thing that can save me is a surrender of myself, a surrender from my nature, and to not expect nature to do anything that can save itself. And you see how there's some truth into that, right? Anyway, so that's his laying out of the Protestant understanding, and he does so well. And you see that it has a coherence, even though I think it's definitely wrong. And so does Ratzinger, and so does St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure, and de Lubac and Father Gaudry Lagrange and Ambrose Gardet, which are the people I'm going to side with, of course. But I think it's worth respecting the coherence of this understanding, and that there's a lot in it that's true, but ultimately it is incorrect. Okay. Okay, we've gotten to the nub of this conversation about the relationship between nature and grace. And let's see, I might have, because I mark my books, right? So I highlight things. And so I'm kind of going through my highlights here. I might have missed a section that's important. So I apologize about that. There's too much here. So I'll just do my best. Um, but going back to the difference between de Lubac and the Neotomists, the Neotomists will say God creates. He creates natures. Natures have their own proper ends, and here we have Aristotle, right? Uh, the formal and final causes are related. Hey, Steve, I saw you left the chat. Thanks, appreciate it. So in Aristotle, right, the formal and the final cause inform each other, right? Something is what it is in light of its end, and the end of something is known in light of what that thing is, right? And so for the Neotomist here, God creates natures, and natures have their own forms and therefore their own ends. And so the end of a nature is going to be natural because it's when God created, he did not create something supernatural, right? Because that's what the word means. It's beyond nature, right? And so the Lubach, so the Neotomists here will say, therefore, when revelation happens, nature is its end is extended beyond itself, right? And its end is now a supernatural end, but it's not because of anything in nature, right? It's something in a certain sense extrinsic, according to the Neo-Scholastic. Now, there is this thing they call obediential potency, which is that certain natures are the types of natures which can be taken up into different higher ends. But that is something that one way, if I understood him correctly, Dr. Matthew Minard put it this way. He said, obediential potency is what's at the borders of nature, right? And one example that I think it was him as well who told me this. One example is shoot, I can't remember what it was. I think it was like certain things in nature. For example, a tree. This might be a good example. A tree has the obediential potency of being a book, right? But it doesn't have the natural potency of being a book. It requires a man to do something to it to turn it into a book. And so that would be the Neotomist, if I understand it correctly, understanding of obediential potency and the relationship between nature and grace. De Lubac will say that's too extrinsicist, and and he doesn't like it. Where was I going with this? Yes, okay. And so the Neo-Thomists are saying when we read Thomas, we see nature and the Aristotelian causes, and then we see grace and here, the data from Revelation, you might say. And the way both fit together is obediential potency, right? That's my understanding of the Neo-Thomistic reading. De Lubac comes in and says, no, nature, paradoxically, through no merit of its own, is made for a supernatural end from the beginning. Because if in reality, not abstractly, this is de Lubac, if in reality, men, which are natural beings, are made for the vision of God and communion with him in the supernatural order, then The vision of God is the final end of the formal cause of man's humanity. Therefore, that final end must inform the formal cause, right? And therefore, man is made for a supernatural end in his nature, the Lubak will say. But he also adds that God does not owe to man's nature that final end because it's a gift. And he adds this really interesting phrase. He says that man is the kind of creature that is made for an end he doesn't deserve. So the Lubach relies heavily on this notion of paradox. And we'll come back to it because there's something there that's really interesting, I find. But, okay, that's happening in the Thomistic area, right? Just got a message here. I'm gonna pull this up. I appreciate this. Peace in Christ. Much love for talking about these topics academically and like a nerd. Heck yes. Instead of bathing in the vat of scandal to attract views. Yeah, if I could get more views on these videos, sometimes I make videos, like I've made videos in the past. I don't want to bring it up, but I made videos in the past that were controversial that got a lot of views. They blew up, right? And then I'll make a video about something that really interests me, like this, and then I get like I'm exaggerating, 200 views at most, right? Um, I agree. Yeah. I see. I appreciate these kind of messages. Okay, back to what I was saying. So that's the Thomistic field. But here's the thing: we got the Saint Bonaventure and the Scotists, and it's funny because the Neo-Scholastics accused the Lubach of being Scotistic in his reading of Saint Thomas, which I actually find interesting, right? But okay, let's see. Ratzinger goes the Bonaventure route. Ratzinger says, we're talking about nature, we're talking about grace. What if there's a third category, right? And he says, Bonaventure, in fact, says there is. Now, here's the thing Bonaventure, and this is where the Lubach intrigues me in a positive way, because Bonaventure sometimes will talk about this conversation with two categories, nature and grace. And then sometimes he'll be more detailed and bring up this third category. And it really revolves around the difference between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, between the Thomists and the Bonaventurians. Um, and the difference is the between the intellect and the will. So here is Bonaventure's schema of what's going on. For Bonaventure, it's not just nature and grace, but it's nature, will, and grace. The technical words he uses, and there's three different sets here. I'm going to start with the first one, is cursus naturalis. That's the first one, which means natural course. Then it's cursus voluntarius, the voluntary course. And then cursus mirabilis, which is miraculous course. Now, here the term miraculous can be abused, I think. What he means here, at least that's my understanding, is that something that is from above and not from below, that's from God and not from man, in the realm of the supernatural and not the natural, grace, not nature. Um, so in a certain sense, that's extrinsicist, right? Eh, but the middle category is what prevents it from being radically extrinsicist, like you might see in some of the reformers. Okay, so Ratzinger says this means that human will is presented as a separate middle order between mere nature and God's own freedom. This in turn corresponds to the fact that when speaking concisely, Bonaventure distinguishes between natura and supernaturalia, natura and gratia, within man himself. And when he speaks at greater length, he again sets up three relations, and then we're about to read what they are. But notice that, right? Within man, this is why I'm intrigued in a positive way by de Lubac, even though he might actually be, well, I don't want to say wrong yet, but what I'm saying is that I'm intrigued because he's saying Bonaventure is both keeping the distinction between nature and grace while also saying that in man, you have something that accounts for his end as supernatural, but in man as a creature, right? And so it's a paradox in Bonaventure as well. But the paradox is illuminated, you might say, by this third category of the will, which I really want to get into because the will is an interesting thing. and But anyway, these three relations. So we talked about these three courses. Now we talk about these three relations in Bonaventure. And you have the relation a natura, by nature, the relation a libero arbitrio, right, which is by free will, and the relation a Deo, by God. And these three correspond to three habits, which again, for the scholastic terminology, a habit is what a virtue. A virtue is a habit. I shouldn't. A virtue is a habit, but a habit is not necessarily a virtue. Genus, species. Um, and these three are habitus innatus, innate habit, and then habitus acquisitus, acquired habit, and then habitus infusus, infused habit. So Bonaventure is always doing these triads, which is quite beautiful. It's not Thomistic though, and that would open up the whole realm of the differences between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, which is worth exploring. Not going to do that here just yet, but it's worth exploring. Okay, Ratzinger says between the general realm of nature and the specifically divine realm, Bonaventure interpolates. I always pronounce this word wrong. I get it right in my head when I'm reading, but is it interpolates or interpolates? I don't know. Interpolates the realm of what is distinctively human. In other words, man is kind of like a supernatural nature or a natural uh, uh, person, right? So again, it's kind of paradoxical. Each of these districts has its own area of topics and its own form of knowledge, so that finally we have the following overall scheme. Okay, so now he lays out the Bonaventurian scheme. The Bonaventurian scheme, cursus, so the course, right? Naturalis, voluntarius, and mirabilis sive supernaturalis, miracles or supernatural. Yeah, so sive means or in Latin. Okay, so naturalis, that's the course. Here we have res naturalis, which is natural things. Okay, now we're in the Corso Voluntarius. Here we have humana secreta, human secrets. I like that language. Mirabilis, sive supernaturalis. We have divina mysteria, divine mysteries. Okay, back to naturalis, res naturalis. We have cognitio naturalis, natural knowledge. Okay, now we're in the course of Voluntarius. So here we have humana secreta, and here we have detectio, discernment in the realm of the will. Now we're in the course of mirabilis or supernaturalis, and here we have divina mysteria, divine mysteries, and here he has superna illustratio, heavenly illumination. So nature, will, and grace. Okay, and Ratzinger ends this section by saying, in this subdivision, nature is distinguished from the free will activity of the person. Man's personhood is not included, in the general concept of nature, but rather represents a separate order between God's revelatory actions and what is merely natural. It's a third category, and it's a paradoxical one because he'll talk about the ecstasy aspect of it. Ecstasy meaning something that goes beyond itself, right? Um, the opinion about nature and spirit that is connected with this becomes clearly evident in the answer to the question of whether the human will could have lifted itself out of guilt without divine grace. Back to what I was talking about in the beginning, soteriology. It is clear that the answer to this is negative. Ratzinger is not a Pelagian, right? Nor is Bonaventure. It is instructive, though, how Bonaventure argues in favor of this no against the objection that the body can overcome sickness by itself, and so the spirit, which after all belongs to a higher order than the body, should also be able to overcome by itself its sickness, that is, sin. He's negating that that sentence. That's the issue with Ratzinger. When some people approach him for the first time, he'll say something and they'll be like, "Wait, that doesn't sound right. How could he be saying that?" And then you realize he's he's articulating the position that he doesn't agree with. So let me reread that to make it make sense. He says it is instructive how Bonaventure argues in favor of this no against the following objection. And here's the objection: the body can overcome sickness by itself, and so the spirit, which after all belongs to a higher order than the body, should also be able to overcome by itself its sickness, that is, sin. Bonaventure's like, no, and this is why this is not the case. The saint replies that the comparison falls short, or rather, there is no real comparison at all. And this is why. The principle of bodily healing is nature, while the principle of spiritual healing is something above nature, supranaturam, and that is grace. Nature is still preserved in a case of bodily sickness and therefore can bring about a recovery, whereas grace is lost through sin, so that a fresh infusion of divine love is needed in order to restore the original life of the soul. Because grace is gift. You can't earn a gift, right? But the body, right? Nature, not just the body in this analogy, but nature, right, doesn't become totally depraved. And so it can heal itself. Um, let that was I shouldn't have said that. I scratched that last thing I said because I mixed some analogies in there. The body can heal itself because the principle of its healing is nature. But nature is totally depraved in man when he sins, and he cannot heal himself because the nature of his depravity. So it's not totally depraved, but the nature of his depravity has to do with the will, which is something that can only be healed by grace. If I've confused you, I apologize. Just move on. Ignore that section. Okay. Here is the section that, well, there's three sections here that are really important, and he concludes in a beautiful way. So let's just read it. It's really good. The importance of such a statement is difficult to overestimate, about the fact that the body can heal itself, but nature, the will cannot heal itself, right, from its sin. It needs a fresh infusion of grace, of God's gift of life. The importance of such a statement is difficult to overestimate, for it means that in Bonaventure's view, the human soul is entirely beyond the realm of mere nature. A merely natural soul is inconceivable. An essential feature of the soul is that it cannot subsist in itself alone. It must be preserved by something that is greater than itself, by something supernatural. This supernatural thing does not thereby cease to be a freely given grace that is to be feared only from the standpoint of a naturalism that fails to see that the category of spirit is precisely freedom. So much packed right there. Um, I don't even know how to begin to unpack it. Let's see. So, spirit for Ratzinger. Okay, this goes back to his book Introduction to Christianity. Um, I might have stepped into something too big to uh, talk about, but in Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger explains that we have the option of understanding creation, of the real world as just materialistic. All there is matter, right? And so, what that would mean is that our reason and our thinking evolves and emerges from matter. And so, reason emerges from unreason, which, in a certain sense, is sawing off the branch you're sitting on if that's what you're going to argue. Because if reason emerges from unreason, then what's the reason why I have to believe what you're saying, right? Because there's no warrant. There's no reason to believe in reason if reason comes from unreason. So he dismisses mere materialism, right, and atheism. Then you have the opposite view, which is idealism, that everything is a product of mind. Everything is a product, he called in German, Sinn, right? Sinn, Sinn. Um, um, Everything is a product of mind and of thought, right? And if we stop there with this mere idealism, the issue with that is that everything is not so everything things do not have their own existence and reality. They're just thoughts in someone's mind. And so in a certain sense, everything is God. Everything is in the mind of the thinker. And so there's no distinction between creation and God, between us and God, between things and God. And so that kind of collapses into a pantheism that will ultimately devalue man in his distinctiveness, in his individuality, right, in his personhood. And so Ratzinger concludes that freedom is the category that takes a third course. We see here the Bonaventurian schema kind of imaged, which is that everything is the thought of God and comes from the mind of God, but it's released into an independence of its own. And that independence, what accounts for it, it's is the freedom of what is created. And so that freedom accounts for the ontological weight of what is created. It's not just, we're not just in the matrix, but it's given its own reality. It accounts for matter as well. And so that's why we can't divorce matter and spirit so much. But uh, in other words, that being said, and let me reread this section and it'll shed light on it. The importance of such a statement is difficult to overestimate, for it means that in Bonaventure's view, the human soul is entirely beyond the realm of mere nature. A merely natural soul is inconceivable. An essential feature of the soul is that it cannot subsist in itself alone. It must be preserved by something that is greater than itself, by something supernatural. In other words, if we give this radical independence to the soul, then we are kind of becoming radical materialists and forgetting that it is a product of the thought of God. It's in a relational it's in relation to God. But if we make it radically dependent upon God and do not give it its own independence at a certain level, then its existence is put into doubt and it's just another part of God. I don't know if that made sense, but it must be preserved by something that is greater than itself, Ratzinger says, by something supernatural. This supernatural thing does not thereby cease to be a freely given grace that is to be feared. Let me read that again. This supernatural thing does not thereby cease to be a freely given grace. That is to be feared only from the standpoint of a naturalism that fails to see that the category of spirit is precisely freedom. It does not cease to be supernatural, and thus something that cannot be derived from mere nature. But just as real at the same time is the unique structure of the soul. The immediacy of its relation to God is so intimately essential to it that it cannot exist properly except in being preserved immediately by God. At every moment, spirit surpasses pure nature. In contrast to all attempts in past or more recent times to naturalize spirits, this makes perfectly clear the unique structure of the soul, which can exist only in the manner of dialogue and freedom. Okay, let's maybe summarize all that to give it more to place it in my overall stream of consciousness in this video. What Ratzinger is saying is that um, basically man is a particular thing. He has a nature, right? Um, but his soul is more than natural because he's a person. And because and this is the category of the will. Because the will is free. It's something that goes beyond nature. And that freedom um is in relation to God. And when it severs that relationship, man kind of falls into something that's less distinctively human, more bestial. That's what sin does, right? But in order for that relationship to be restored, man can't do anything to regain that relationship with God. And so it requires an additional gift from God. And this is where grace steps in to restore man uh, to his initial nature, right? And so we see how this category of the will between nature and grace, right, accounts for man's freedom, for his personhood, and the paradox that he is a natural being made for his supernatural relationship with God by being a person. This is the Bonaventurian and Franciscan view. It's not the Thomistic one, right? And so that will have to be hashed out between Thomas and Franciscans. I'm not necessarily siding with Ratzinger here. I'm just kind of laying out things, right? I like it, I do, and I really do think there's something about man as a person that must be just made for that relationship of gift. Um, but it is paradoxical. I want to add something. There's something that's interesting about the Council of Chalcedon, right? Because Jesus Christ is fully God, fully man. He has he has a human nature and a divine nature, and that's why we say that Jesus Christ has a human will and a divine will, a human intellect and a divine intellect. But we say that he is a divine person. He's not two persons, right? That would be um, the mistake that was it Nestorius at one point argued that there'd have to be two persons kind of cohabitating Jesus. Um, what that means is that if Christ is the kind of ground of creation in his incarnation, as St. Maximus would say, then we can hold, on the one hand, a kind of extrinsicism that maintains a firm distinction between nature and grace, and a kind of intrinsicism that we find in the category of person, of hypostasis, right? And here it would be freedom and will and spirit, this third category. And it's a category of synthesis, right? And here might sound a little Hegelian, but in a certain sense, between these two contraries, we can find a unity in this synthesis like category of the person, which is meant to be uh, open to all while being distinctively itself. So anyway, these principles are related throughout Ratzinger's theology. It goes into his eschatology, it goes into his theology of creation, it goes into his soteriology, it goes into his anthropology, especially Trinitarian theology, of course, and Christology, spiritual Christology, the way he talks about Christ's pro-existence and the Eucharist. It goes into the sacraments. That's what I love about this theologian, right? Is that all his stuff is connected. It's coherent thinking. It's even though he develops certain things, right? But it's coherent thinking. Okay. How long have I been going? Oh my gosh, now we're in 2 minutes. Well, I'll have to do a second video. I'm kind of running out of steam, but I'll continue a Nature and Grace Part 2, Ratzinger weighing in, because he says more and there's more to it. So I'll stop here with the reading. Maybe if I can go back to the controversy. Oh, I want to bring up something that I watched this video on Timothy Flanders' channel, The Meaning of Catholic, where he invited Dr. Jared Goff to talk about the Second Vatican Council in light of scotistic metaphysics, or just the kind of Franciscan tradition in general, bringing up Father Peter Damien Fellner um, and his legacy. He says a lot of he says a lot of things that Ratzinger would agree with because Ratzinger is very formed by Augustine and Bonaventure, and so there's a lot of overlap there. Um, but I don't I don't want to just say therefore the Franciscan metaphysical schema is the way to go and the Thomists are wrong, because I'm more of a Thomist. I'm more on the side of St. Thomas overall, metaphysically, anthropologically, and in many areas. And so I want to say that we have, because a system, a metaphysical system or a theology, is not this easily defined thing that you can put in a jar and delineate and distinguish from another school of thought. I mean, if something is truly a rich vision of the world, then it's going to have a certain porousness to it that can interact with other ways of thinking in a way that is not a clash, but constructive and conducive to further deepening of our vision of things. And so, I wanted to pray. I wanted to acknowledge the profound similarities precisely because of Bonaventure, but also, going back to the Thomist debate, um, at face value, and I want to qualify this. At face value, at first, now I'm not so sure anymore, but at first, I was convinced that de Lubac was right, because and I'm reading his Surnaturel right now, but, so I haven't done all the reading yet, but I was convinced from conversations with other people that de Lubac was right because he's able to maintain a distinction between nature and grace, and to, also maintain man's, end as being supernatural, even though it's the end of a natural creature, right? And you seem to find in Aquinas both that distinction and that end, that unity at the end there, that man is made for a supernatural end. And so I thought to myself, people who are saying that's not the case in Aquinas are just pointing to all the areas where Thomas distinguishes between nature and grace, and de Lubac accounts for that. And de Lubac, basically is saying, but look at all these other passages where Saint Thomas is clear that the supernatural end is man's end as man, and that's why I thought at first, and I'm still thinking this through, that de Lubac was right. But I was listening to another video, and I don't spend most of my time watching YouTube videos, but there's this particular channel which is called Foi et Raison. It's a from Belgium. It's a channel on YouTube. It's in French, so if you speak French, check them out. If you don't, I don't know. Maybe they have subtitles. Um, but it's called Foi et Raison, and on it, the host interviewed Father Thomas Joseph White, which I've read a bit of him, and I like him a lot. But there was one article he wrote that really annoyed me, and I disagreed with it. But anyway, but he's way smarter than anything I've ever done in school. But he said something that caught me off guard, which is that in Thomas, he's not just distinguishing nature and grace, um, in the sense of, and yet reuniting them in, when it comes to man's end. What he's doing is Thomas is engaged in conversation with Averroes and Avicenna and Maimonides, and um, and he seems to be trying to argue for a natural end, um, when engaging conversation with these non-Christians. And so that would lend credence to the obediential potency uh, understanding. Excuse me. Because if Thomas is distinguishing nature and grace so as to basically make a Aristotelian case, going beyond Aristotle, but using Aristotle, that man has a natural end to seek to, which is God, but it's not the vision of the Trinity. That would lend credence to the neo-scholastic interpretation. But here's the thing, uh, and I'm nobody. I'm thinking this through, so please don't take this wrong. And I've been, I've changed my mind on a lot of things, and I'm willing to change my mind here and to look into it more. And I'm a newbie, but here, caveats being made. If that's the case, then it doesn't strike me like a good idea from Aquinas. If that's what Aquinas is saying, I'd have to think about it because it doesn't sound right. Um, and the reason why it doesn't sound right, and which is why I like Ratzinger and Bonaventure's take, it doesn't sound right precisely because it seems to be something that Bonaventure feared, which is um, relying on Aristotle too much in a way that could lend itself. And again, I'm new here. I'm just doing my best. Could lend itself to a kind of framework that favors secularism, right? So, and yet I do want to add that it is in Thomas that the vision of God, of the Trinity is man's end. So I don't know. But it seems to me that this is a lot more thorny than I thought. And de Lubac, his category of paradox is, I think it's true, right? But does that mean that that is what Thomas says? I do think Thomas is all he doesn't say the same thing sometimes. Anyway, this is me working through this, right? It seems that Thomas is saying two different things at times, and I think it might be because he's engaging with these Muslims and Jews. Anyway, I'm running out of steam, but it's a really interesting topic, and I'm very new to it. And if you're a theologian and you watch this and you want to point me in a certain direction, put it in the comments. And I got to go ahead and keep reading, so that you go ahead and finish that. And there's a bunch of other books in this area that I intend to read, but life, work, school, everything. Well, that's all I got. Let's see if you guys have any questions. Let me pull up some of these comments here. Ratzinger said, I paraphrase, the time has come to recognize relation as equiprimordial with substance. That is a key to all of this thought. Um, yeah, I agree with you. Although I wouldn't say equiprimordial. I know you're paraphrasing, right? But and I agree with you. Like relation is very important, but almost in a certain sense, not just equiprimordial, but primordial, like before substance. Relation, but not relation understood according to Aristotle, because for Aristotle, relation is an accident that can only inhere in a substance. But for Ratzinger, and I would argue others before him and others, during his time, which he's gone now, right? Saw relation as prior. So let's see what Rachel says here. But I agree with what you're saying. Relation is so important. Norris Clark has some good stuff on this. That's what I want to see, man. Like people like Norris Clark. That's what I want to see. Uh, you know, Thomists who his book, the one of the many, is called A Contemporary Guide to Thomistic Metaphysics. I think that's the subtitle. And like uh, I was talking to a friend about this. Oh, there's just too much going on in my mind right now. But we gotta be able to bring Thomas um, into today. And I know a lot of people have been doing that, right? I'm not trying to say no one's doing it. A lot of people are doing it. But let's do more of it. I think it's so exciting to see stuff like that. Thomas being shedding light on reality, but in an updated way. And I'm being careful with that word. I'm not saying let's distort Thomas or something, right? We got to be faithful to him, but updated way. Um, do Delubach, so thanks for the question, Rachel. Do Delubach and Aquinas address how the fall strains the relationship or perhaps initiates a dichotomy in our thinking about nature and grace? Um, well, let me reread that. Just Aquinas address how the fall strains. Yeah, no, definitely. Actually, Ratzinger brings this up, and I'm gonna cover it in the second video because I've run out of steam, and I hate to punt on your question, but Ratzinger will talk about it in the second video I make. He'll talk about this in a way that I found very helpful. He has a kind of dialectic I find really interesting. Um, so stay tuned. Sorry to punt on that. Richard DeClue asks, Father Brian Mulliday has a course on YouTube on nature and grace. Yeah, I'm not convinced he describes the Lubaka properly, but it's worth a look. Even he, as a Thomist, pushes against the Neo-Thomists. Yeah. I started that. I haven't finished it, but I've started that because I'm taking a nature and grace class. Although my class, surprisingly, is it could probably more aptly be called law and grace because we're not really talking about nature yet. We're just talking about law. I don't know why. I'm okay with that because I'm learning so much about St. Thomas's understanding of law, and I'm totally fine with that. It just means I'll have to do this on the side, or maybe we'll get into it in the next few weeks. I don't know yet. I haven't looked ahead at the syllabus. Um, Father Molde says that those who try to insist on two ultimate final ends misunderstand natures, which can only have one final end. That's really interesting. And for man, that is the beatific vision. I agree with that. Yeah, that's really good. And yep, Rachel, stay tuned for the next part. Thanks for listening. Um, so yeah, so I think that's good for today. 1 hour and 14 minutes is a long haul. So if you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really appreciate it. and I am becoming poorer and poorer every day and will not be able to continue my studies unless y'all help me. So consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project if you want me to continue in this field, or I'll have to work at McDonald's. And if you want to read some articles or reach out to me, consider going to theecclesiablog.com. There's a contact page. There's some articles. I finally linked my podcast episodes to this website and got rid of the other one, which had a weird URL. Anyway, thanks everybody, and I really appreciate your time watching this stuff. I hope it helps, and if anything, it's a log for me to come back to in the future as I continue my studies. God bless everyone.